The year is 1989, and I was preparing a group of interviews to celebrate the Barnard Centennial with an oral history project. I had spoken with many wonderful Barnard alums, but now the day had come for the keystone interview of my project. I had looked forward to this interview for months and had prepared for it, and hoped against hopes that it would turn out just perfectly. I thought back to my college days when just a nod from this person as she walked about the campus picking up cigarette butts and little pieces of paper so our campus should be pristine would give me a smile, a look, and I would be thrilled. It would make my day. And now I would have her to myself for 2 whole hours, and I was scared stiff. As I drove on that rainy day in January to Massachusetts, over and over in my head, I turned the questions I would ask. Are they too forward? Are they not direct enough? When I arrived, I wasn't ready. But as soon as I looked out of the window, as I pulled into the driveway of a 50s ranch house in Massachusetts and saw a lovely petite lady with gray hair in a cotton dress and a woolen sweater and a large dog by her side that looked almost as though it came to her waist, all of my anxiety floated away. I jumped out of the car. We walked on the path towards each other. She held out her hand and said, "Welcome to Tyringham. Hope you didn't have any trouble getting here." We went inside, and it was a comfortable, lovely home, but there were no doilies out, there was no crystal, there was no china, as I had encountered in some interviews. It was very plain, it was very lovely. She said, "Have you eaten lunch?" I was so scared I had forgotten whether I'd eaten lunch or not. But I said, "Well, no, but if you're having lunch, I'll join you." She said, "Wonderful." We stood in the kitchen and made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches side by side. And I said to myself, oh my God, if my classmates could only see me now. We then sat down at a rustic table, and she looked at me and said, "Will you have something to drink?" I said, "Oh, this is just lovely," wondering how the peanut butter would ever get down. And she said, "Well, I always think a good interview is best when preceded with a glass of port wine." She brought out the port, and I said, "So do I." We had a glass of port wine, and let me tell you, you must try it sometime. Peanut butter and jelly and port wine. The interview went just as I expected it would. She was forthright, she was profound, she was marvelous. I sat there and I tried not to look like the idolatrous student that I had always been, getting the gems of wisdom dropping down. I tried to be very sophisticated, an interviewer, and she put me at ease instantly. I was quite amazed to find out that the woman that all of us in 1954, when I was at school, we considered the greatest of the college presidents, and we were so lucky to have her, had had a very hard time when she came to Barnard. There were diehards on the faculty who thought that a woman with 5 children, married, and who had not been at a college immediately previous to that, but at a girls' school called Brearley in New York City, was not really the person for Barnard. She soon proved them very wrong. We had never guessed that. To us, she was manna from heaven. We were also quite unaware, I think, at that time, of her concern for the mental and emotional condition and health of her girls. At the weekly talk, she talked about ambition, she talked about using our education, and about having it all. But she never talked that much about our emotional health. And I was quite amazed to hear that one of the reasons she began the advisory system of an advisor for each class in the college when she came, replacing the single advisor that had preceded her, was that a young woman she had known as a student at Brearley, who had then come to Barnard, had when she encountered a serious emotional problem received in Mrs. McIntosh's mind insufficient counseling and had later committed suicide. Mrs. McIntosh told me, or Mrs. Mack as we called her, told me that she was convinced the first thing she would do was put in an advisory system. The wonderful interview came to an end after 2 hours. The time flew. That had never happened to me before in an interview. And I looked at her and said, "Mrs. Mack, have you returned to the campus recently?" She said, "That's a wonderful story. I'm so glad you asked me." It seems that several years before, she had come up from Baltimore, where she was visiting family, and was to meet her son Carrie and her daughter-in-law, who taught over at Columbia, and to go to their apartment on Claremont and 116th Street. Her train arrived much sooner than she had expected, and so not knowing quite what to do with herself on that dark night, she wandered over into the campus and thought she might go into the library and sit for a while and wait for them until they came out of their meeting at 9:30, the time she had been expected. A security guard stopped her as she approached the library and said, "Your ID, please." Mrs. Mack looked at him and said, "Sorry, I don't have one. But, young man, I do have some information that I think might persuade you I can enter the library." And she pointed over at the McIntosh building, saying something about that building and herself. He kind of looked at her strangely and said, "Know anyone on buildings and grounds?" She said, "Well, I used to know everybody on buildings and grounds, but I'm afraid I don't know anyone anymore." He looked a little frightened, and he called security. He got off the telephone and said to her, "Sorry, ma'am, but I just can't let you in." At that moment, she remembered deep in her suitcase an old driver's license that hadn't been used recently, but that she thought might come in handy someday for identification. She pulled it out and showed it to him. He looked at it, and she said, rather than looking at her name or her picture, he looked and said, 1898? 1898? You'd better go right in and sit down. She told me that we had a good laugh, by the way, the port, the story. She told me that later on, she found out that a strange old lady had been periodically walking off Broadway into the Barnard campus, claiming that she had personally built Millbank Hall. And she smiled at me and said, "Obviously, that's exactly who he thought I was." I looked at her and I said, "Well, how did you feel when something like that happened? Were you upset at all?" She said, "Oh, my dear, not at all. I wrote a long letter to the supervisor of this young man telling him what a wonderful job he was doing and how he should get a raise." That, to me, sums up Mrs. Mack. For all of us who knew her or thought we knew her, all the wonderful things we thought about her, well, they were all true.